Hi guys, tonight we're going to drift far back in time to a world that feels both familiar and completely strange at the same moment. You are not in a city, not in a village, not even in anything that would recognize itself as human civilization. Instead, you're standing on an ancient savanna, where tall grasses move like slow waves under a warm but uncertain wind, and the sky above you is so wide it almost feels like it is leaning down to listen. The air carries the smell of dry earth and distant smoke from small, scattered fires, somewhere far away. You hear the faint call of birds settling for the night, and closer than you would like, the grass shifts in ways that make your mind quietly pay attention. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Before we go further, it helps to understand the world you're stepping into around 200,000 years ago. Early Homo sapiens were not living in cities or farms. They were small groups of foragers moving through landscapes shaped by drought, shifting climate, and unpredictable resources. A mainstream historical fact is that early human survival depended heavily on mobility, meaning people rarely stayed in one place for long, always following water, plants, and migrating animals. This constant movement shaped not only their bodies but also their minds, especially the way they processed danger. You begin walking slowly across the grass, feeling how uneven the ground is beneath your feet. There are no paved paths, no walls, no artificial light. Everything is open and exposed, and quietly uncertain. And in this kind of environment, your senses start to change. You notice sounds more sharply. You notice shadows more deeply. You begin to feel how awareness itself becomes a survival tool. Fear, in this world, is not something abstract. It is immediate. It rises when the grass moves a little too suddenly. It tightens your attention when the wind shifts direction without warning. It makes your body pause before your thoughts even form. And this is where something important begins, something that scholars remain divided on. Researchers continues to question whether fear evolved primarily as a response to predators, or whether it first developed as a broader system for navigating uncertainty in unpredictable environments. You are not alone here. Though it is hard to say what counts as company, a small group of early humans is nearby, partially hidden among low trees. Their presence is quiet, almost invisible. You notice how they move together, how they stay close without speaking much. Their communication is not language as you know it, but gestures, glances, and subtle shifts in posture. Everything is calm, but never fully relaxed. As you watch them, you start to understand something fundamental. Fear is not only about running from danger, it's about staying aware enough to avoid becoming surprised. In a world where surprise often means risk, awareness becomes life itself. The savanna stretches endlessly in every direction, and yet your attention keeps pulling you back to small details. A broken branch, a sudden silence in insects, a ripple in the grass that does not match the wind. You begin to notice how the human mind, even in its earliest form, might have been shaped by this constant scanning, this quiet expectation that something important could happen at any moment. There is also a quirky detail that historians and archaeologists sometimes point out. Early humans, long before complex tools, often use sharpened sticks and simple stone flakes not just for hunting but for processing scavenged remains left by larger predators. It was not a glamorous survival, it was careful, opportunistic, and deeply intelligent in a way that modern life sapiens life sometimes forgets. Even this behaviour may have reinforced fear responses, because every successful scavenging moment required approaching areas where danger had recently been present. You pause again, and the wind carries a faint rustle through the grass. Your body reacts before your thoughts do. a small tightening in the chest, a subtle shift in posture. This is where fear begins to feel almost automatic, something built into the system rather than chosen. And this is exactly what makes it so powerful in human history. Some historians suggest that fear in early humans was closely tied to a predator awareness, especially large carnivores that shared the same landscapes. Others disagree, arguing that fear likely evolved first as a generalized uncertainty response, later refined by specific threats. This ongoing scholarly debate continues to shape how we understand the evolution of the human mind. As evening approaches in this ancient world, the light begins to soften. The savanna changes colour, becoming deeper, quieter, almost more intimate. You feel how visibility decreases slowly, and with it, certainty also fades. And yet, this is normal here. Night is not an interruption, it is part of the cycle. You sit near the edge of a small fire that someone has carefully maintained. The flames are modest, flickering gently, casting moving shadows across nearby faces. Fire is one of the most important developments in human history, and it plays a role here even in this early setting. It offers warmth, protection, and light, but it never fully removes fear, it only reshapes it. Around the fire, you notice how the group settles slightly. Shoulders relax, but eyes still scan the darkness beyond the light. Even safety has limits in this world. The boundary between comfort and uncertainty is always thin, and as you remain here, in this quiet prehistoric night, you begin to understand something simple but profound. Fear is not an enemy in this landscape, it is a companion, a constant, silent guide that has followed humanity from its earliest steps across the savannah all the way into the present moment. You wake into a softer light now, as if the ancient world has quietly continued without pausing for your arrival. The night has not fully lifted, but it has thinned into a pale grey glow that sits low over the savannah. The air feels cooler than before, carrying the faint dampness of dew settling into dry grass. Somewhere nearby, you hear movement, slow and careful, and as if life itself is trying not to disturb the morning. Before anything else takes shape in your mind, it helps to understand what life means here, in this period of early human existence. Survival is not necessarily centered around homes or territories in the way modern life understands them. A mainstream historical fact is that early human groups were highly mobile hunter-gatherers, typically moving in small bands of around 20 to 50 individuals, following seasonal food sources like plants, fruits, and migrating herds. This mobility shaped every part of their daily experience, from what they ate to how they thought about safety. You stand and begin to follow the group you noticed earlier. They are already moving, stepping lightly through the grass with a rhythm that feels practiced rather than hurried. There is no clear path, only patterns remembered through repetition. You notice how even children move with surprising awareness, staying close to adults without needing spoken instructions. The ground is uneven, scattered with stones and patches of dry earth that crack slightly underfoot. Every sound feels amplified in the early quiet. A bird calls once, then stops, as if reconsidering whether it should announce itself so openly. As you walk, you begin to see how survival here depends on constant attention. Food is not stored in pantries or markets. It is found, gathered, or caught. Plants are inspected carefully, roots are dug out with simple tools, and anything unfamiliar is treated with caution. This is where fear begins to reveal its usefulness again. It is not just a reaction to danger, but a filter that helps decide what is safe enough to touch. A mainstream observation among archaeologists is that early human diets were surprisingly diverse, often including a wide range of plant matter, small animals, insects, and scavenged meat. This flexibility was crucial, because no single food source could be relied upon year-round. In a world shaped by shifting climate, adaptability was not optional. You notice the group pausing near a cluster of low shrubs. Some individuals bend down, examining leaves with slow precision. Others scan the horizon instead, watching for movement that does not belong. The group seems divided in attention, yet unified in purpose. It is a silent coordination that does not require language. There is a small fire pit left from the night before, its embers still faintly warm. Someone carefully adds dry grass and gently blows until a thin thread of smoke rises. The smell is sharp, earthy, and oddly comforting. Fire here is not only warmth, but also protection. Even predators are less likely to approach areas marked by smoke and light. A quirky detail that researchers sometimes point out is that early humans likely used natural substances in ways that might surprise modern expectations. For example, traces of plant fibers found in ancient teeth suggest that some groups may have used chewing sticks, both for cleaning and for comfort. There is also evidence of ochre pigment being applied to skin, possibly for symbolic identity, protection from insects, or social signalling. Scholars remain divided on whether these practices were purely functional or whether they already carried early forms of cultural meaning. You continue walking, feeling how your awareness sharpens in subtle ways. Every rustle in the grass feels slightly meaningful. Every distant sound carries a question. And yet, the group does not appear panicked. Their alertness is steady, almost routine. This is what life has trained them to be. In the distance, you catch sight of movement. A herd of animals shifts slowly across the open plain, their shapes partially blurred by the rising light. The group pauses again, watching carefully. No one speaks. Decisions here are made through observation rather than instruction. This is where fear becomes most visible in its ancient form. It is not loud or overwhelming. It is quiet, distributed across the group like a shared awareness. If one person senses danger, others respond instantly, not through words but through posture and movement. The system is fast, efficient, and deeply ingrained. Researchers continue to question whether this form of collective awareness was driven more by individual brain evolution or by social necessity. Some argue that fear became more refined as group living increased, while others suggest it was already present in solitary ancestors and simply adapted to social environments. As you move with them, you begin to notice small routines that structure the day. Certain areas are revisited regularly. Certain plants are checked in predictable cycles. Even rest is not fully restful. People sit in positions that allow quick movement if needed. Comfort is always balanced with readiness. The sun rises higher now, warming the grasslands. Light spreads across the landscape, revealing details that were hidden in the dimness of early morning. You see distant hills, faint paths carved by animal movement, and scattered clusters of trees that offer occasional shade. Everything feels open, exposed, and alive. At one point, the group stops near a shallow stream. Water moves slowly over stones, producing a sound that feels almost too peaceful for this environment. Everyone drinks carefully, scanning the surroundings between each sip. Water is essential, but it is never assumed to be safe. Another observation from archaeological research is that early humans often return to specific water sources repeatedly, creating informal patterns of movement that may have influenced later migration routes. These patterns were not mapped, but remembered collectively through experience. You crouch near the water, feeling its coolness in your hands. The sensation is immediate and grounding. For a moment, the alertness in your body softens, but even this softness is temporary. A shadow passes near the edge of your vision, and your attention sharpens again without effort. A faint debate among scholars continues about whether early human fear responses were primarily shaped by the environmental unpredictability or by specific evolutionary pressures such as predator avoidance. There is no final agreement. only overlapping interpretations that try to explain the same ancient instinct from different angles. As the group prepares to move again, you notice how efficiently they gather themselves. There is no rush, no chaos. Everything is done with practiced economy. Even fear, when it appears, is absorbed into movement rather than disrupting it. You realize that in this world, fear is not something that stops life. It is something that allows life to continue at all. It keeps attention alive. Decisions sharp and groups connected in ways that are quiet but essential, and as you follow them further into the wide and uncertain landscape, the morning feels less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something that has always been happening. The sun has now climbed higher, and the savannah feels different under its full weight. The grass no longer looks soft and grey, but instead turns a pale gold that shimmers when the wind moves through it. Heat begins to rise from the ground in slow waves, and you can feel it against your skin like a quiet pressure that never fully settles. Before you continue walking with the group, it helps to understand what shapes this world beyond just survival. In the early Pleistocene and late Pleistocene periods, climates were not stable in the way modern humans experience seasons today. A mainstream historical fact is that repeated glacial and interglacial cycles cause dramatic shifts in temperature and vegetation, forcing early human populations to constantly adapt or migrate. This instability meant that predictability was rare, and unpredictability became the normal condition of life. You move with the group across open ground where visibility stretches far in every direction. There are no buildings, no artificial boundaries, only the natural divisions of terrain, trees and water. Every horizon feels both inviting and uncertain at the same time. As you walk, you begin to notice how attention works here. It is not passive, it is active, almost physical. Your eyes are constantly scanning, not because you're trying to be afraid, but because not scanning would feel unsafe. Fear in this environment is not a reaction after danger appears. It is a system that prepares the body before anything happens. A mainstream observation in anthropology is that early humans likely developed enhanced pattern recognition skills, allowing them to detect subtle changes in animal behavior, weather shifts, and environmental cues. This ability would later become one of the foundations of human intelligence, but even at this stage, it is tied closely to survival pressure. You pass through a narrow stretch of trees where the light becomes dappled and broken. The temperature drops slightly here, and the air smells different, richer, more humid. You notice how the group adjusts automatically. They slow down, they spread out slightly. No one says anything, but everyone becomes more alert. This is where fear begins to show its most practical function again. It does not freeze the body, it organizes it. It spreads awareness across multiple individuals, ensuring that no single person carries the full burden of vigilance. A quirky detail that researchers often mention is that some early human sites show evidence of repeated occupation over long periods, even when resources were not always abundant. This suggests that memory of safety or familiarity may have been as important as immediate resource availability. In other words, humans may have returned to places not only because of food, but because those places felt survivable. You step over uneven roots and notice small insects scattering quickly beneath your feet. Even these tiny movements seem meaningful here. Nothing is dismissed automatically, everything is briefly evaluated, then either ignored or stored in memory. The group pauses again, in the distance. There is movement among the tall grass. It is not clear what it is, only that it's large enough to disturb the plants. No one reacts loudly. Instead, there is a collective stillness. Bodies lower slightly, heads tilt, eyes narrow. A mainstream fact from paleoanthropology is that early humans coexisted with a wide range of large predators, including saber-toothed cats, hyenas, and large canids, even when direct encounters were rare. The constant possibility of such encounters shaped behavior profoundly. You feel your own body respond before your thoughts catch up. Muscles tighten slightly, breath becomes more measured. This is the ancient architecture of fear at work, operating without language, without instruction. Researchers continue to debate whether this response is primarily hardwired or shaped heavily through early childhood learning. Some suggest that infants show early sensitivity to looming shapes and sudden movement, while others argue that cultural reinforcement plays a larger role than biology alone. The movement in the grass fades, and the group slowly resumes walking. No one seems surprised that nothing happened. That, in itself, is part of the logic of this world. Many signals do not lead to events, but every signal must still be taken seriously. As you continue, you begin to notice how sound behaves differently here. There is no background noise in the modern sense. Every sound is isolated, distinct, and potentially important. A bird call, a branch snapping, wind shifting through dry grass. Each one could mean nothing or everything. Another subtle detail from archaeological studies is that early human groups likely developed shared resting patterns, often sleeping in clusters or semicircular formations. This arrangement may have provided both warmth and a sense of collective safety. Even if actual protection was minimal, scholars remain divided on whether these arrangements were primarily practical or socially symbolic. The sun is now high, and shadows have shortened. Heat intensifies, and movement becomes slightly slower. You feel the effort of walking more clearly in your legs, and you notice how the group adjusts pace without discussion. Energy is conserved carefully. Nothing is wasted. At one point, you stop near a scattered collection of stones that seem deliberately placed. Someone from the group examines them briefly. These stones are not random, they are tools, or at least potential tools. Sharp edges, fractures, and shapes that can be used for cutting or scraping. A mainstream historical fact is that early stone tool technology, often referred to as older one tools, dates back over 2 million years and represents one of the earliest clear signs of human ancestral intelligence. These tools were simple but effective, created through controlled striking of stones to produce sharp edges. You pick one up carefully. It is heavier than expected, rough against your palm, and strangely reassuring in its solidity. There is something about holding a tool that reduces uncertainty slightly. It does not remove fear, but it channels it into capability. A quirky archaeological observation is that some early tools show signs of being carried long distances, suggesting they were valued beyond immediate use. This implies early forms of planning or attachment to useful objects, even before complex language existed. You continue walking, now more aware of how everything in this landscape is interconnected. Fear, attention, tools, movement, group behavior. Nothing exists in isolation. Each element supports the others in a system that has been refined over countless generations. As afternoon begins to settle in, the light grows softer again and the group starts to look for a temporary resting place. Shade becomes important now, not only for comfort but for conserving energy during the hottest part of the day. You settle under a low tree with sparse leaves, feeling the ground cool slightly beneath you. Around you, people sit quietly, some resting, others still scanning the horizon. Even in rest, awareness does not fully disappear. And in this quiet pause, you begin to sense the deeper truth of this world. Fear is not a single emotion that appears when danger arrives. It is a constant background system, shaping perception, guiding movement, and quietly influencing every decision made in silence. The heat of the afternoon settles over the landscape like a heavy blanket, and the group you have been following drifts into a quieter rhythm. Movement slows, voices soften, and even the wind seems less urgent now. You remain seated beneath the sparse shade of a low tree, feeling the rough bark against your back and the warm earth beneath your legs. The world feels still, but never fully safe. To understand what is happening beneath this quiet surface, you need to step away from the savannah for a moment and look inward, into something far older than language or culture. A well-established finding in neuroscience and paleoanthropology is that the human brain contains deeply ancient structures, such as the amygdala, that are heavily involved in detecting threat and triggering rapid emotional responses. These systems are not recent inventions of modern life. They are inherited from early mammals and even earlier vertebrate ancestors, refined over millions of years of evolution. You imagine, for a moment, that something shifts inside you, not a thought, not a decision, but a signal, something small and fast, like a spark in the dark. Before you even identify what you are feeling, your body has already responded. That is the world the early human mind was built for. Around you, the group rests in scattered positions. Some lie on their sides, others sit upright with the knees drawn close. Even in stillness, there is structure. People position themselves where they can see open ground. No one fully turns their back to the wider landscape. It is a habit that does not need explanation anymore. It is simply how bodies learn to exist here. Inside your mind, something begins to take shape. Fear is not just a reaction to danger, it is a system that prepares the body for possibility. Long before language, long before planning, the brain was already learning how to ask a silent question. What if something happens next? You look toward the horizon. Nothing is there, yet your attention lingers. This is the quiet architecture of survival, built not on certainty, but on anticipation. Archaeologists have noted that even in early hominin species, cranial endocasts suggest gradual enlargement of brain regions associated with sensory integration and emotional processing. These changes did not happen suddenly. They unfolded slowly across vast stretches of time, shaped by pressure, environment, and social living. Fear, in this sense, is not a single invention. It is an accumulation. You shift your weight slightly, and the ground responds with a soft crunch of dry grass. Nearby, someone opens their eyes briefly, scanning without speaking. There is no instruction, yet the group remains loosely synchronized, like a shared awareness distributed across many minds. A lesser-known observation from comparative anatomy studies is that many mammals display a startle response that is remarkably consistent across species. A sudden movement, a sharp sound, a shadow passing overhead, all trigger immediate physical reactions that bypass conscious thought. In early humans, this reflex did not disappear. It became more sophisticated, layered with memory and pattern recognition. You notice how even now, your own attention behaves like that. It does not wait for permission. It moves first, then explains later. The wind picks up slightly, brushing through the grass in uneven waves. For a moment, the sound resembles distant footsteps, though nothing is there. Still, your body reacts in a subtle way, not fear exactly, but readiness. A quiet tension that rises and falls without instruction. Some researchers propose that the evolution of fear circuitry in the brain may have been driven less by direct predator encounters and more by the need to manage uncertainty in complex environments. Others argue that predator pressure was the dominant force, especially during periods when early humans shared landscapes with large carnivores. The disagreement continues, shaped by new fossil evidence and shifting interpretations of ancient behavior. You lean back against the tree again, feeling its rough surface steady you. Above, the light filters through sparse leaves, creating shifting patterns across the ground. These patterns move gently, almost rhythmically, and for a moment your mind follows them instead of scanning the horizon. This is where something subtle becomes visible. Fear is not always sharp or intense. Sometimes it is quiet, like a background hum in the nervous system. It does not announce itself, it simply shapes how attention flows. A quiet but important detail in evolutionary psychology is that the brain often prioritizes potential threats over confirmed safety. This means that uncertainty itself can carry emotional weight, even when no real danger is present. In early environments, this bias likely increased survival chances, even if it sometimes led to unnecessary caution. You watch the group again. One person stands slowly and walks a short distance to check something in the grass. Another follows without being asked. Their movements are calm but purposeful. There is no panic here, only coordination shaped by long practice. A curious artifact found at some prehistoric sites is the presence of repeated scratching or marking on stone surfaces that may not have had direct functional use. Some interpretations suggest these marks could represent early forms of symbolic behaviour, while others argue they were simply byproducts of tool maintenance or idle activity. The truth remains uncertain, but the possibility itself is revealing. You pick up a small stone near your hand and roll it between your fingers. It is smooth on one side, rough on the other. The contrast feels strangely meaningful, as if even simple objects carry layers of history you cannot fully see. Above you, the sky shifts slowly as the afternoon begins to soften. The light loses some of its intensity, becoming warmer, more diffuse. Shadows lengthen again, and with them, attention subtly sharpens. The group begins to stir, preparing for movement before evening approaches. Inside your mind, something remains steady. Not fear itself, but the system that produces it. A quiet awareness that does not switch off. Even in rest, it is always there. Adjusting thresholds, scanning patterns, preparing responses before they are needed. And as you rise with the others, you begin to understand that what you call fear is not a flaw in the human experience. It is one of its oldest forms of intelligence, still echoing through every step you take across this ancient land. The group begins moving again as the afternoon light shifts into a softer tone, as if the world itself is slowly exhaling. The heat is still present, but it no longer presses down as heavily as before. Shadows stretch longer now, and the savannah begins to feel less exposed, more layered, as if new possibilities are hiding inside every fold of grass and stone. Before you follow them further, it helps to understand what survival truly meant in this stage of human development. Across multiple archaeological sites, researchers have found evidence that early humans relied not only on physical strength or tools, but on decision-making under uncertainty. A widely accepted fact in anthropology is that early hominin survival depended heavily on rapid environmental assessment, meaning individuals had to constantly evaluate risk versus reward in real time without the benefit of long-term prediction models or written knowledge. You walk behind the group, noticing how their formation subtly changes as they move. It is not rigid, but flexible, adapting to terrain and perceived risk. Some individuals move closer together when crossing open ground. Others spread out slightly when entering areas with better cover. There is no spoken instruction guiding this behavior, only shared understanding built through repetition. Fear, in this world, is not an isolated sensation. It is distributed. It lives in posture, in spacing, in the timing of movement. It is almost like an invisible coordination system that helps the group function as one unit without needing formal structure. A lesser-known but important detail in paleoanthropological research is that early human footprints preserved in sediments sometimes show sudden changes in directional pacing, suggesting moments of alertness or hesitation. These subtle patterns hint that even without modern cognition, ancient humans were highly responsive to environmental cues that demanded immediate adjustment. You step over uneven ground and feel how your body naturally adjusts balance before you consciously think about it. That same principle governs everything here. Reaction often comes before reflection. In the distance, You notice a thin line of trees marking the edge of a shallow valley. The group slows slightly as they approach it. Valleys like this often hold water during certain seasons, making them valuable but also potentially dangerous due to limited visibility and higher chances of ambush by animals. A mainstream observation in prehistoric ecology is that transitional zones, such as the edges between forest and open savanna, were especially rich in resources but also carried elevated risk. This duality likely played a significant role in shaping early human caution and exploration patterns. You follow the group into the beginning of the valley. The air becomes cooler here, and the sound of wind is reduced. Instead, you hear more localized noises, small rustles, faint bird calls, the shifting of leaves above. Everything feels slightly enclosed, even though there are no walls. Your attention sharpens again. Not because something has changed dramatically, but because visibility has decreased. In early environments, reduced visibility often meant increased uncertainty, and uncertainty was enough to activate ancient survival systems. Some scholars argue that fear responses in humans were originally designed not to respond to specific threats, but to changes in informational clarity. In other words, the brain may have evolved to react strongly whenever it could not fully interpret the environment. Other researchers disagree, suggesting that specific predator pressures remain the primary driver of these systems. The debate continues across fields like evolutionary biology and cognitive archaeology. The group stops briefly near a cluster of stones partially embedded in the ground. One individual kneels and examines them. These stones appear different from others you have seen earlier. Their edges are sharper, and some surfaces show signs of repeated striking. A widely accepted fact in archaeology is that early stone tools, particularly those associated with Aldoan and later Herculean traditions, represent some of the earliest evidence of deliberate shaping of materials for functional use. These tools mark a major shift in cognitive development, indicating planning, foresight, and an understanding of cause and effect. You crouch beside them and notice how each stone feels like a decision made visible. A strike here, a fracture there, each one altering what the object can do. It is simple, but also deeply intentional. A quirky but often discussed detail in lithic studies is that some tools appear to have been carried even after they were no longer sharp, possibly due to familiarity or perceived usefulness beyond immediate function. Some researchers interpret this as early attachment behavior, while others see it as purely practical caution. The group moves on, leaving the stones behind. You follow, noticing how your own awareness has become more attuned to small details. The tilt of grass, the direction of movement, the subtle pauses between actions as the valley deepens slightly. You begin to sense how fear operates here in a very different way than modern life might suggest. It is not dramatic. It is not overwhelming. Instead, it is continuous, like a soft layer of awareness that adjusts itself depending on context. A key finding in behavioral anthropology is that early human groups likely developed shared vigilance systems, where individuals rotated between scanning and resting, ensuring that no single person remained overloaded. This cooperative structure may have been essential for long-term survival in predator-rich environments. You notice this now without being told. One person watches ahead, another glances back, another checks the sides. It is fluid, automatic, and deeply ingrained. The light continues to shift, becoming warmer and lower. The valley begins to glow with a muted orange tone, and long shadows stretch across uneven ground. The environment feels quieter, as if the world is preparing itself for another transition. Inside you, something remains constant, a steady readiness that does not disappear even in moments of calm. It is neither panic nor stress. It is simply awareness shaped by countless generations of selection, refined into something that now feels almost natural. And as you continue walking deeper into this ancient landscape, you begin to see that fear is not something humanity developed and then carried forward. It is something humanity was built from. Layer by layer, moment by moment, across time too vast to fully comprehend, the valley begins to open again as you move forward with the group, and the air shifts in a subtle but noticeable way. The warmth of the afternoon is fading now, replaced by a gentler coolness that settles low across the ground. Shadows grow longer and more defined, stretching between stones and grass like quiet reminders that the day is slowly giving way to evening. You notice something different in the group's behaviour. The pace is no longer exploratory, it is purposeful, directed toward a familiar location. There is a sense of return rather than discovery, as if the day's movement has a natural endpoint that everyone already understands without needing words. Before you reach it, it helps to understand what fire meant in this stage of human existence. Across multiple archaeological sites in Africa and the Near East, evidence suggests that controlled use of fire by early humans became more consistent roughly between 400,000 and 1 million years ago. It did not appear as a single invention, but rather as a gradual mastery of something already present in nature. You follow the group into a sheltered area where the wind is softer. The ground here is slightly darker, as if it has been shaped by repeated use over long periods. Stones are arranged loosely in a circular pattern, and in the centre, you notice faint traces of ash embedded into the soil. A few individuals begin to gather dry grass, small branches and pieces of bark. The movements are practiced, almost ritualized through repetition. There is no hesitation in how they prepare the materials, even though the outcome is not guaranteed every time. A widely accepted finding in archaeology is that early fire use likely began with opportunistic control of natural fires, such as those caused by lightning, before humans developed the ability to reliably produce fire themselves. This transition would have taken a very long time, with generations learning not only how to maintain fire, but how to preserve it across changing conditions. You kneel near the centre of the circle and watch closely. One individual leans forward, carefully arranging dry material. Another crouches nearby, holding a smouldering fragment, possibly carried from a previous location. The air is still for a moment, as if the entire group is waiting for a small possibility to become real. Then it happens slowly. A faint glow appears, barely visible at first. A thread of smoke rises, thin and uncertain. The group does not react loudly. Instead, there is a quiet collective focus, as if everyone understands how fragile this moment is. As the glow strengthens into a small flame, you feel a shift in the atmosphere, not just physically, but emotionally. The space becomes more defined, more contained. The edges of the world seem to move slightly farther away. Fire changes everything here. It creates a boundary between safety and uncertainty that did not exist before. It extends waking hours, allows food to be processed more effectively, and reduces the presence of certain predators. But it does not eliminate fear. Instead, it reshapes it into something more manageable. A lesser-known detail often discussed in archaeological literature is that traces of burned animal bones found at early human sites suggest not only cooking, but also social gathering patterns centered around fire. These spaces may have functioned as early focal points for communication, rest, and shared awareness. You sit closer now, feeling the warmth spread across your skin. The heat is immediate and comforting, especially after the gradual cooling of the valley. Light flickers across faces around you, changing their appearance in soft, shifting patterns. Shadows move slowly behind them, as if the night itself is observing from a distance. Outside the circle of light, the landscape remains present but less defined. Darkness does not disappear. It simply moves back, held at a distance by flame. And yet, you can still feel its presence beyond the edges of visibility. This is where fear takes on a new shape. It is no longer only about sudden movement or immediate danger. It becomes something that exists at the boundary of light and dark, known and unknown. Some researchers suggest that the control of fire may have played a key role in the evolution of human social cognition, encouraging longer periods of gathering and communication after sunset. Others argue that fire's primary influence was purely practical, centered on survival efficiency rather than psychological development. The debate continues, shaped by ongoing discoveries and reinterpretations of ancient evidence. You watch as someone adds more fuel to the flame. It responds quickly, rising slightly before settling into a steady rhythm. The sound is soft, a gentle crackling that blends with the night air. It feels almost like breathing, as if the fire itself is alive in a simple, predictable way. Around the circle, bodies relax slightly, but not completely, even here. Awareness does not vanish. People still glance outward occasionally, checking the darkness beyond the light. Safety is stronger, but never absolute. A quirky observation from experimental archaeology is that replicated early fire setups show how easily flame behavior changes with wind, fuel type, and arrangement. This fragility likely meant that early humans had to maintain constant attention to fire, reinforcing both care and caution in equal measure. You notice how this attention becomes shared. No single person seems fully responsible. Instead, awareness is distributed, like a quiet agreement that the fire must remain alive. This shared responsibility creates a subtle rhythm in the group, a balance between rest and vigilance. The heat now feels stable, the earlier tension from the valley has softened, replaced by something slower and more grounded. You can feel your breathing naturally adjust, becoming deeper, less sharp. A widely discussed point in evolutionary anthropology is that fire may have contributed to changes in human sleep patterns, possibly extending wakefulness into evening hours and gradually influencing social bonding. Some scholars remain cautious about directly linking fire to cognitive evolution, suggesting that the environmental and dietary factors played equally important roles. You lean slightly closer, watching the flames shift and fold into themselves. There is no fixed shape, yet it feels consistent in its behavior. This paradox is strangely calming, something that changes constantly, yet remains predictable enough to trust. In the distance beyond the light, you hear faint movement in the grass. It is impossible to identify, and no one reacts strongly. The fire holds the center of attention now, and everything else exists at the edge of awareness rather than its core. You begin to understand something quietly important. Fire does not remove fear, it organizes it. It draws a line between what can be seen and what must be imagined, and in doing so, it allows the mind to rest without fully letting go. As night settles more deeply around the valley, the group remains gathered in a slow circle of warmth and flickering light. The world beyond it is still there, still vast, still uncertain, but for now, it is held at a distance just long enough to breathe. Night begins to settle more fully over the valley, not as a sudden change, but as a slow cooling of the world. The last traces of orange light fade from the horizon, leaving a deep blue canopy overhead. Stars begin to appear one by one, faint at first, then gradually more numerous, until the sky feels almost dense with quiet light. The fire remains at the center of the group, steady and small, its glow shaping everything around it into warm tones and soft shadows. Beyond it, the world becomes less certain. Shapes lose detail, distance becomes harder to judge, sound feels closer than it should. To understand why this matters so deeply to early human experience, it helps to consider how night functioned before artificial lighting. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that for most of human prehistory, darkness was not simply the absence of light, but a distinct environmental condition that required active adaptation. Vision alone was no longer sufficient. Other senses took priority. You sit near the fire, feeling the warmth against your skin, while your eyes constantly adjust to the boundary between illuminated space and darkness. That boundary is important here. It is not just physical, it is psychological. A well-supported finding in human evolution studies is that nocturnal environments likely played a major role in shaping human sensory prioritization, especially the tendency to rely heavily on auditory and visual threat detection under low-light conditions. In simpler terms, the brain becomes more alert when certainty decreases. Around you, the group remains quiet, not silent but restrained. Conversations, if they happen at all, are minimal and brief instead. Communication seems to occur through posture, glances, and subtle shifts in position relative to the fire. You notice how people naturally arrange themselves so that some face outward, toward the darkness, that's all. Others remain closer to the center. This arrangement feels unspoken but consistent, as if learned through long experience rather than instruction. A lesser known observation from ethnographic parallels in modern hunter-gatherer groups is that nighttime gatherings often serve both social and protective functions, reinforcing group cohesion while also distributing vigilance. Even when no immediate threat is present, the structure remains. You lean back slightly and look up. The sky feels enormous without artificial light. Stars appear sharper, more defined, and more overwhelming in number. It is the kind of sky that does not feel distant, but present. Some researchers propose that early human emotional responses to night skies may have influenced the development of symbolic thinking, as the inability to fully explain celestial patterns encouraged interpretation, storytelling, and meaning-making. Others remain cautious about drawing direct connections between perception and cognitive evolution, suggesting that multiple factors likely contributed. A faint rustle comes from the edge of the firelight. Heads turn briefly. No one moves quickly. The reaction is measured, almost routine. After a moment, the sound fades, possibly caused by wind moving through dry grass. The group settles again. You begin to notice how fear behaves differently at night. It is not stronger exactly, it is more diffuse, less tied to specific objects and more connected to uncertainty itself. Darkness removes detail, and without detail, the mind fills gaps automatically. A quirky detail often mentioned in an experimental psychology is that even modern humans, when placed in low-light environments, show increased sensitivity to ambiguous sounds and peripheral movement. This suggests that the underlying mechanisms are still present, even if modern life rarely activates them fully. The fire crackles softly, sending small sparks upward that disappear quickly into the dark. Each spark feels like a brief interruption in the stillness above. Around it, faces glow and fade in slow cycles as flames shift. You notice a quiet behavior among the group every so often. Someone looks away from the fire and scans the outer darkness for a few seconds, then returns their gaze to the center. It is a rhythm that repeats without coordination, a shared habit of checking what cannot be fully seen. A widely accepted point in anthropology is that early human social structures were strongly influenced by environmental pressures that required cooperative vigilance. In conditions where predators and unknown risks were part of daily life, group cohesion became a critical survival advantage. You feel the subtle weight of that now, not as fear, but as awareness distributed across many minds. It is as if each person holds a small portion of the night, making it more manageable together than alone. The wind shifts slightly, carrying a cooler draft across the valley. Grass moves in slow waves beyond the firelight. For a moment, it's easy to imagine movement within it. Though nothing clearly emerges, your attention sharpens instinctively. Some scholars suggest that this tendency to perceive agency in ambiguous movement may have been evolutionarily advantageous, even if it sometimes led to false alarms. Others argue that it is simply a byproduct of a highly efficient pattern recognition system that prefers caution over certainty. The debate remains open across cognitive science and evolutionary theory. You pull your knees closer to your body, feeling the ground beneath you steady and firm. The fire continues its steady rhythm, offering a center point in a world that otherwise feels fluid and undefined. A lesser discussed archaeological detail is that many early hearth sites show repeated layering of ash and organic material, indicating long-term reuse of the same fire locations. This suggests that certain places may have held not just practical value, but also emotional or social significance over time. You begin to see how this space functions. It is not only a source of warmth, it is a boundary marker, a shared focus, a temporary anchor in a landscape that otherwise offers no fixed reference points after dark. The night continues to deepen, stars become more prominent, and the air grows cooler. The group remains gathered, resting but attentive, as if sleep itself is something negotiated carefully with the environment rather than surrendered to completely. Inside you, something remains gently active, not alarm, not tension, but a quiet readiness that does not fully switch off. It is old, it is persistent, and it is shared across time, stretching back far beyond memory, into the earliest moments when humans first learned to sit together in the dark and listen. The night settles more deeply now, and the valley feels as if it has narrowed into a smaller, more intimate space defined entirely by the reach of the fire. Beyond it, the world is still there, vast and unknowable, but it no longer demands immediate attention. For a brief time, attention can rest closer to home. You notice that the group's energy has shifted again. Earlier alertness has softened into something more social, though still restrained. People adjust their seating positions, draw closer together, and occasionally exchange quiet gestures that feel like fragments of communication rather than full conversation. To understand what is unfolding here, it helps to step back into the broader context of early human social life. Evidence from archaeology and anthropology suggests that small group living was the dominant form of human organization for the vast majority of our species' history. These groups were not structured like modern communities, but instead relied on fluid roles, shared responsibility, and constant cooperation for survival. You sit within this circle of firelight, feeling how presence itself becomes meaningful. You're not simply an observer of individuals, you're inside a network of attention, where every person is both watching and being watched in a gentle, continuous loop. A well-established finding in social neuroscience is that humans are highly sensitive to facial expressions, tone, and posture, even in low-information environments. This sensitivity likely evolved to maintain cohesion within small groups where misunderstandings could have serious consequences. In this sense, social awareness becomes a survival tool as much as physical vigilance. A quiet exchange happens nearby. Two individuals share a brief sequence of gestures, followed by a subtle shift in posture that suggests agreement or understanding. There is no need for explanation. Meaning is carried through rhythm and familiarity. You realize that fear, too, is part of this shared language, not as words, but as signals, a slight stiffening of the body, a pause in movement, a glance towards a darkness. Each one communicates something that others immediately understand without translation. A lesser-known observation from primatology is that many primate species use similar nonverbal cues to coordinate group vigilance, especially during rest periods. These behaviors likely form an evolutionary foundation for human shared awareness. The fire pops softly, sending a brief scatter of sparks upward. The sound is small, but it draws attention for a moment. A few heads turn, then relax again. Even harmless surprises are noticed here, not because they are dangerous, but because attention is always partially open. You lean slightly forward, feeling the warmth shift across your face. The heat is steady now, no longer fluctuating as much as when the fire was first lit. It has reached a stable rhythm, and with it, the group's behavior becomes more relaxed, though never fully unguarded. A widely supported idea in anthropology is that extended evening gatherings around fire may have contributed to the development of more complex social cognition, including memory sharing and early forms of storytelling. Some researchers remain cautious about directly linking fire use to narrative development, suggesting that these capacities may have evolved independently but were later enhanced by social conditions. Around you, the group seems to settle into a quieter phase. Some individuals lie down with heads resting on folded arms. Others remain seated, eyes occasionally drifting toward the outer darkness. There is no formal shift into sleep, only a gradual easing of activity. You notice how sound becomes more important as vision weakens. The crackle of fire, the rustle of clothing, the faint movement of grass beyond the light. Each sound carries disproportionate weight in the mind, as if it might reveal something unseen. A quirky detail often noted in experimental studies of perception is that humans tend to overestimate the proximity of sounds in dark environments, a tendency that likely helped early humans respond quickly to potential threats even when visibility was limited. You shift slightly and feel the ground beneath you, warm where the fire reaches and cooler where shadows begin. This gradient of temperature becomes another form of awareness, subtle but present, helping you understand where safety feels strongest. The night air carries faint movement again from beyond the firelight. This time, no one reacts immediately. After a brief pause, someone glances outward, then returns their gaze to the center. The group remains calm but attentive, as if confirming that nothing has changed. A mainstream finding in evolutionary psychology is that humans tend to maintain a baseline level of vigilance even during rest, a trait believed to have increased survival in environments where threats could emerge unpredictably. This baseline never fully disappears, even in safe conditions. You begin to see how this entire system operates. It is not divided into fear and safety, but instead exists as a continuous adjustment of attention. The fire does not eliminate uncertainty, it simply reduces its intensity enough for rest to occur alongside awareness. A lesser, discussed archaeological insight is that repeated evidence of hearth-centered activity suggests that fire sites were not only functional but also social anchors that structured time and behavior. They may have served as the earliest form of shared domestic space. You feel your breathing slow slightly, becoming more regular. The warmth, the rhythm of the fire, and the quiet presence of others combine into something steady. Not comfort in a modern sense, but a controlled version of uncertainty that feels momentarily manageable. The sky above continues to shift slowly. Stars remain constant, but the atmosphere between them fills a lull with depth. The world is still vast, still unpredictable, but it is held at a distance by flame and group presence. And in this suspended moment between alertness and rest, you begin to understand something subtle. Early human fear was never meant to disappear. It was meant to coexist with life, guiding it gently, continuously, and without ever fully falling silent. The fire has now settled into a quieter rhythm, as if it too has entered a resting state. Flames no longer leap as high as before, but instead sway gently, bending with the smallest shifts of air. The circle of light feels smaller than it did earlier, more concentrated, like the world has drawn a careful boundary around this group of early humans. You notice that the valley beyond that boundary feels increasingly distant, not physically, but perceptually. Darkness gathers more thickness between you and the unseen landscape, and what lies beyond it becomes less about what is there and more about what might be there. To understand what this moment represents, it helps to consider how early humans began to communicate risk. Archaeological interpretations of symbolic behavior suggest that before fully developed language, early hominins likely relied on a combination of vocal sounds, gestures, and patterned behaviors to signal environmental awareness. These systems were not formalized, but they were effective enough to coordinate group responses. You observe a subtle shift in the group. One person makes a soft sound, almost like a breath shaped into meaning. Another responds with a small nod. Nothing dramatic changes, yet the group's attention briefly tightens, then relaxes again. It is communication without structure, but not without clarity. A well-supported idea in cognitive anthropology is that human communication likely evolved first through emotional signaling rather than structured grammar. In this view, tone, rhythm, and urgency preceded words, allowing early humans to transmit states such as caution or reassurance long before abstract language fully developed. You listen closely to the surrounding night. The fire crackles softly, but beyond it, the world is mostly soundless. That silence is not empty. It is layered, filled with distant insect movement, faint wind shifts, and the occasional rustle that cannot be easily identified. A lesser-known observation from field studies of modern foraging societies is that nighttime sounds are often interpreted collectively rather than individually. One person's reaction to a sound can influence the group's interpretation, creating a shared sense of whether something is worth attention or not. You feel this happening subtly around you. A sound occurs in the grass beyond the light. One person glances toward it. Another follows. No one moves quickly. After a brief pause, the group collectively decides it is nothing. The attention disperses again like water settling after a ripple. Fear here is not isolated. It is distributed, almost like a shared emotional field. It does not belong to one individual. It passes between them, shaped by observation and response. A widely accepted finding in evolutionary neuroscience is that the human brain is particularly tuned to social referencing, meaning individuals often look to others to interpret ambiguous situations. This mechanism likely increased survival in early environments by reducing incorrect responses to uncertain stimuli. You sit quietly, noticing how your own attention begins to follow this pattern. You do not simply react to the environment. You react to how others react to it. Awareness becomes layered, social, and continuous. A quirky detail often mentioned in behavioral studies is that even in controlled modern environments, humans tend to shift their perception of threat based on group reactions, sometimes overriding their own initial interpretations. This suggests a deep evolutionary foundation for shared vigilance. The fire shifts again, producing a low sound as a log settles inward. The glow briefly intensifies, then softens. Shadows respond immediately, stretching and shrinking in slow motion across the ground. The movement feels almost like breathing around the circle. Bodies continue to relax in stages. One person lies fully down now, eyes half closed but still occasionally opening. Others remain seated, their posture less rigid than before. Sleep does not arrive suddenly here. It approaches gradually, like a cautious visitor. You notice how even relaxation contains structure. Arms are positioned for quick movement. Heads remain angled slightly toward open space. No one fully abandons awareness, even in rest. It is as if vigilance has been woven into the fabric of behavior itself. A mainstream finding in archaeology is that many early human campsites show evidence of repeated long-term occupation, suggesting that groups return to familiar resting locations over time. These sites often contain layered hearths, tools, and food remnants, indicating cycles of use and return. You imagine how memory of place must function here, not as maps or written records, but as embodied familiarity. A place is remembered through sensation, through how safe it felt before, through whether night passed without disruption. A lesser discussed interpretation among researchers is that spatial memory in early humans may have been strongly tied to emotional experience, meaning that fear and safety contributed directly to how environments were mentally mapped and recalled. You shift slightly, feeling the ground adjust under your weight. The fire continues its steady presence, and the darkness beyond it remains unchanged. though your perception of it subtly softens. What once felt sharply unknown now feels held at a consistent distance. A quiet movement occurs at the edge of the light. A small animal, perhaps, or simply wind-disturbing dry grass. No one reacts strongly. The group has reached a state where not every signal demands response. Experience has refined their thresholds. You begin to understand that fear here is not constant intensity. It is calibration. It rises and falls in response to context. But it never fully disappears. It remains available, always ready but not always active. A well-established principle in psychology is that the human nervous system maintains a baseline level of arousal even during rest, allowing for rapid transition into alertness if needed. This system is not a flaw. It is an adaptation shaped by environments where unpredictability was the norm. The fire dims slightly again. Settling into a quieter glow, the group becomes even more still. Some eyes close fully now. Others remain partially open, drifting between awareness and rest. And in this balance between sleep and vigilance, warmth and uncertainty, you begin to see the deeper pattern. Early human fear was never designed to end. It was designed to soften, to lower itself just enough for life to continue beside it. The fire has quieted further now, reduced to glowing embers that pulse faintly in the dark like a slow heartbeat. The circle of light is smaller than before, but somehow more intimate. The valley around you feels even more distant, as if the night has gently folded itself around the group and sealed out everything unnecessary. You notice that conversation, such as it is, has nearly disappeared. What remains is presence, breathing, occasional shifting of weight, the soft settling of bodies into the earth. It is not silence exactly, but something softer, more continuous, like shared stillness. To understand what begins to unfold here in human history, you need to step into the early world of belief and interpretation. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that as human cognition developed, unexplained environmental events began to be assigned meaning beyond immediate survival function. This did not happen suddenly, but gradually, as pattern recognition extended beyond the physical world into the abstract. You watch as someone near the fire stares into the embers without speaking. Their gaze feels fixed, but not empty. It is as if the fire is not just warmth anymore, but something that can be observed for meaning, rhythm, or guidance. A widely accepted idea in cognitive archaeology is that early symbolic thought may have emerged from the human tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli, especially in low-light or uncertain environments. In such conditions, the mind often constructs narratives to fill gaps in perception, creating meaning where none is immediately obvious. The embers shift slightly, collapsing inward and then glowing brighter for a moment. That small change draws attention from several individuals at once, not because it is alarming, but because it is noticeable. In this world, anything noticeable carries potential importance. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic studies of traditional societies is that fire itself is often treated not only as a tool, but as a participant in social life. It is something that must be watched, respected, and occasionally responded to, as if it has its own rhythms that require interpretation. You lean forward slightly, feeling the last remaining warmth reach your hands. The heat is gentle now, almost like memory rather than force, around you. The group has entered a quieter phase of rest, but no one is fully disconnected from their surroundings. In the distance, the night shifts again. A faint sound passes through the grass, too soft to identify clearly. Heads turn briefly, then settle. The group evaluates the sound together, silently, and decides without words that it does not require action. Fear here is not a sharp interruption. It is a background process, constantly running, constantly adjusting thresholds of attention. A mainstream finding in evolutionary psychology is that Humans tend to overinterpret low-visibility environments, assigning meaning to ambiguous shapes and sounds more readily when sensory input is limited. This tendency likely increased survival chances in ancient environments, even if it occasionally produced false interpretations. You notice how this works inside you as well. The absence of clarity does not create emptiness, it creates possibility. And possibility, in turn, requires evaluation. A quirky detail often mentioned in studies of perception is that even modern humans, when exposed to dim lighting and unfamiliar environments, show increased neural activity in regions associated with threat detection. Even in the absence of actual danger, the ancient system remains active beneath modern life. The fire now barely flickers, but it still holds the center of attention. Its remaining glow defines the group's world in soft gradients of orange and shadow. Beyond it, everything becomes less structured, less certain. A small shift occurs in the group. One person adjusts their position closer to another. It is not explained, not discussed, but it changes the spatial rhythm of the circle slightly. Proximity here is not just comfort, it is part of safety. Some researchers suggest that early human social bonding may have been reinforced by shared exposure to environmental uncertainty, where collective presence reduced individual stress responses. Others caution that social bonding likely emerged from multiple overlapping pressures, not a single cause. You feel the weight of that closeness now, not emotional intensity, but structural reassurance. Being near others reduces the space in which uncertainty can grow. A lesser discussed archaeological interpretation is that repeated evidence of tightly clustered sleeping arrangements in early camps may indicate that physical proximity was itself a form of environmental adaptation, rather than purely social preference. The embers shift again, collapsing slightly inward. A faint spark rises and disappears quickly into the dark. No one reacts. The group has learned which changes matter and which do not. You begin to sense how fear operates here at its most refined level. It is no longer about immediate escape or reaction. It is about calibration of attention across time, adjusting constantly to balance rest with readiness. A widely supported concept in neuroscience is that the brain maintains predictive models of environment, continuously updating expectations based on sensory input. When input becomes uncertain, these models become more active, increasing vigilance even without external triggers. The night feels deeper now, but not heavier. It has become familiar through repetition. The group's breathing slows in unison, not coordinated, but aligned through shared rhythm. And in this quiet, almost suspended moment, you begin to understand something fundamental. Early human fear did not fade as intelligence grew, transformed into something quieter, more distributed, and far more persistent. It became part of how reality itself is interpreted, even in the absence of danger. The fire is nearly surrendered now, leaving only a cluster of dim embers that glow and fade like distant breathing. The circle of light is fragile, barely holding back the night around you. The valley is no longer a visible landscape, but a suggestion of one, shaped by sound, memory, and imagination rather than sight. The group is quieter than before, not because anything has changed suddenly, but because the night has reached a deeper stage where activity naturally slows. Bodies settle into resting positions, though never in a way that feels fully vulnerable. Even in sleep, there is structure. To understand what comes next in the long story of human development, it helps to look at how early humans began to organize meaning in the world beyond immediate survival. Archaeological interpretations of symbolic artifacts suggest that by the late Paleolithic period, humans were already creating markings, pigments, and arrangements of objects that likely carried meaning beyond practical use. You notice faint traces of ash drifting upward from the embers, disappearing into the darkness above. It is easy to imagine how such movement could feel meaningful to a mind trying to interpret a world filled with uncertainty. A widely accepted finding in cognitive archaeology is that symbolic thinking likely emerged gradually from practical pattern recognition, rather than appearing suddenly as a fully formed cognitive ability. In other words, meaning-making may have grown out of survival thinking, not replaced it. You sit still and let your eyes adjust to the faint glow. The boundary between firelight and darkness feels thinner now, more delicate. It is not a wall anymore, but a gradient, a slow transition from known to unknown. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic studies of traditional societies is that even simple objects like stones, bones, or pieces of wood can take on symbolic significance when repeatedly encountered in shared contexts. Over time, familiarity itself can become a foundation for meaning. Around you, the group remains still, but not motionless. Occasional shifts of posture ripple through the circle like small waves. Someone adjusts their arm, another turns their head slightly toward the fire. These movements are minimal, but they maintain a sense of collective awareness. You begin to sense that fear in this world is no longer only about immediate survival. It has begun to extend into interpretation. What is unknown is not just avoided, it is also imagined. A mainstream idea in evolutionary psychology is that the human brain evolved to prioritize incomplete information, filling gaps with probable scenarios based on past experience. This predictive tendency increases efficiency, but also introduces uncertainty into perception itself. The embers collapse again, producing a brief brighter glow. Several eyes open at once, no one speaks. The reaction is shared, automatic, and then quickly released. The moment passes, and the group returns to stillness. A quirky detail often noted in studies of perception is that humans tend to assign more emotional weight to low-light visual cues, such as flickering or partial movement, than to fully illuminated scenes. This likely contributed to heightened awareness during nighttime conditions in early environments. You notice how your own attention behaves similarly. It drifts toward the edges of visibility, where certainty is weakest, not because danger is present, but because uncertainty invites interpretation. A faint sound moves through the grass beyond the firelight. It is soft, irregular, and impossible to define clearly. The group responds with subtle awareness, not action. After a few seconds, the sound fades or is absorbed by the night. Some researchers propose that this kind of shared attentional response may have been a precursor to more structured communication systems, where group members learn to align perception before developing language to describe it. Others argue that communication and perception likely co-evolved in more complex ways, without a single linear progression. You feel how the group breathes together in this moment, not synchronized, but harmonized through shared environment. The fire remains the center, even as it weakens. A lesser discussed archaeological pattern is that many early hearth sites show repeated evidence of careful maintenance, even when fuel resources were scarce, suggesting that preserving fire may have held importance beyond utility, possibly extending into social or cognitive significance. The embers shift again, sinking lower. The glow becomes intermittent now, appearing and disappearing as material collapses inward. The circle of light shrinks further, and darkness presses closer, but still does not cross the boundary. Inside you, something remains active, not alertness in a sharp sense, but a continuous readiness that never fully disengages. It is subtle, almost invisible, but constant. A widely supported concept in neuroscience is that the human brain maintains a default mode of prediction even during rest, continuously modeling potential changes in the environment. This system is not turned off by sleep alone. It softens, but it remains present. The group begins to enter deeper rest now. Some bodies lie fully still, others maintain slight movement. Small adjustments that preserve comfort and orientation. Even sleep here is layered with awareness. And as the fire fades further into embers, you begin to see how fear has become something far more integrated than reaction. It is not a response to danger alone, it is a way of continuously interpreting the world, even when nothing is happening at all. The fire has now diminished to a faint scatter of glowing points, barely holding shape in the dark soil. It feels less like a flame and more like a memory of flame, something that exists only because you know it was once brighter. The valley around you is almost entirely swallowed by night now, with only the faintest suggestion of terrain beyond the circle. The group has settled into deeper rest. Movement is rare, slow, and minimal. Even the small adjustments of sleeping bodies feel like part of a larger rhythm, as if the group is still functioning as one organism even in sleep. To understand what begins to happen in human thought at this stage of cultural development, it helps to look at how early societies interpreted events that could not be immediately explained. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that as symbolic thinking expanded, humans increasingly attributed meaning to patterns in nature, including dreams, weather changes, and unexpected occurrences in daily life. You remain half aware, sitting close enough to the embers to still feel a faint trace of warmth. The night feels deeper now, not because it has changed, but because your perception of it has adjusted. Darkness is no longer just absence. It feels structured, layered, almost inhabited by possibility. A widely accepted finding in the study of ancient cognition is that early humans likely experienced dreams as extensions of waking reality rather than separate mental states. This interpretation is supported by ethnographic parallels in many traditional societies, where dreams are treated as meaningful experiences with social or environmental significance. You notice how your own awareness begins to drift slightly. Not fully asleep, not fully awake, thoughts become less linear. Images appear and dissolve without clear structure. It is as if the mind is beginning to practice the kind of pattern making it uses during the day, but without external input. A lesser-known observation from anthropological fieldwork is that some hunter-gatherer cultures report dreams as sources of guidance or warning, often influencing decisions about movement, hunting, or social interaction. While interpretations vary widely, the shared pattern suggests that dream experiences were integrated into survival thinking. Around you, the group remains still. The fire is now only a faint glow, barely visible unless you look directly at it. Yet even this minimal light seems to anchor the space, giving definition to what would otherwise be complete darkness. You hear a soft shift in the grass beyond the resting circle. It is subtle, almost indistinguishable from wind. No one reacts immediately. Then, after a pause, a single person slightly adjusts their posture, orienting themselves more towards the sound's direction. Nothing follows. The group remains calm. Fear at this stage of night is no longer active in the same way it was earlier. It is compressed into background awareness, present but subdued. It no longer demands response, only readiness. A mainstream idea in evolutionary neuroscience is that sleep in early humans likely evolved in a way that preserved partial environmental monitoring, allowing the brain to remain sensitive to auditory and tactile cues even during rest. This would have provided a survival advantage in environments with unpredictable threats. You feel this yourself in fragments, distant awareness of space, a faint sensitivity to sound, a sense that even in stillness, the mind is not fully offline. A quirky detail often discussed in sleep research is that modern humans still show micro-awakenings in response to unexpected environmental changes, even when in deep sleep stages. This suggests that ancient vigilance systems remain embedded within modern sleep architecture. The embers pulse faintly again, briefly brightening before sinking back into near darkness. The moment is small, but it ripples through awareness. A few eyes open and then close again. No one speaks. The group has learned that not every change requires interpretation. Some researchers suggest that this balance between sleep and vigilance may have been one of the most important evolutionary pressures shaping human rest patterns. Others argue that environmental factors alone cannot fully explain the complexity of modern sleep architecture, and that multiple influences likely contributed over time. You adjust your position slightly, feeling the ground beneath you cool in contrast to the faint warmth near the fire's remains. The difference between heat and cold becomes another layer of awareness, subtle but constant. A lesser discussed archaeological observation is that many early habitation sites show signs of repeated, long-term nighttime use, suggesting that groups return to familiar sleeping areas not just for resources, but for predictability and safety in shared space. The night continues without interruption. Stars remain visible in gaps between darkness and smoke. The group breathes in a slow, collective rhythm, scattered but unified in pattern. Inside your mind, thoughts become less structured. Images of movement, firelight, shifting grass, and distant silhouettes overlap without clear sequence. This is not confusion, it is transition. A widely supported concept in cognitive science is that the boundary between waking thought and dreaming is gradual rather than absolute, with neural activity shifting slowly across states rather than switching abruptly. The fire is now almost gone, only a faint glow remains, barely enough to define the circle, and yet, even in this near darkness, the group remains together, held by presence more than visibility, and as you drift closer to sleep yourself, you begin to sense something deeper than fear or safety, a continuous thread of awareness that has followed humanity from its earliest nights on the savannah, still present here, still quietly shaping how the mind stays alive in the dark. The last glow of the fire is now barely more than a whisper in the soil, a faint ember light that flickers only when the wind passes through it in just the right way. The valley has fully surrendered to night. There is no longer a clear horizon, only layers of darkness that deepen the further you look. The group is almost entirely still now. Sleep has taken most of them, though not in a uniform way. Some lie curled tightly, conserving warmth. Others stretch out more loosely but remain oriented toward the center, where the fire once held stronger presence. Even in rest, there is a quiet geometry to how bodies are placed. To understand what this stage represents in the long arc of human development, it helps to move into the world of early interpretive thought, where humans began to assign cause and meaning not only to physical events, but to unseen forces behind them. Evidence from multiple prehistoric contexts suggests that early symbolic behavior often emerged alongside attempts to explain uncertainty in nature, especially during periods of environmental instability. You remain awake just enough to notice how the night feels different now. Earlier, it felt like something to watch. Now, it feels like something to exist inside. The boundary between self and environment seems softer, less defined. A well-established line of research in cognitive anthropology suggests that the human tendency to attribute agency to natural phenomena may have developed as an extension of social cognition. In simple terms, the same mental systems used to understand other people may have been applied to the natural world, especially when facing unpredictable or ambiguous experiences. You listen to the faint sounds around you, a distant rustle in the grass, the soft shifting of someone turning in sleep, the barely audible crack of cooling earth. None of these sounds demand action, but each one briefly enters awareness before fading again. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic records of traditional societies is that natural environments are often described in relational terms, as if wind, trees, or darkness possess intentional mood. While this does not imply literal belief in modern terms, it suggests a cognitive blending of environment and agency in early interpretive frameworks. The embers shift once more, producing a tiny pulse of light that briefly outlines the circle of resting bodies. For a moment, the group becomes visible again in soft fragments, then returns to darkness as the glow fades. Fear here is no longer tied to immediate physical response. It has become interpretive, operating in the space between perception and meaning. It is the mind asking what something might be, even when nothing clearly is. A widely accepted idea in evolutionary psychology is that human brains evolved a bias toward assuming agency in ambiguous situations. Because false positives were less costly than missed threats in ancestral environments. This bias, while useful for survival, also laid the groundwork for later myth-making and symbolic thought. You feel how this mechanism operates even now. A sound occurs, and before identifying it, your mind briefly opens multiple possibilities. Not fear exactly, but branching awareness. A quirky detail often mentioned in experimental studies of perception is that humans are more likely to perceive meaningful patterns in random visual or auditory noise when placed in low light or low information environments. This tendency appears to increase when sensory certainty decreases. Around you, the group remains in deep rest, but not absolute stillness. Occasional micro-movements ripple through sleeping bodies, small adjustments that maintain comfort and orientation without full awakening. Some researchers propose that early human environments may have encouraged a blending of perceptual interpretation and emotional response, where uncertainty itself carried emotional weight. Others argue that emotional systems and perceptual systems evolved in parallel but remain closely integrated rather than merged. You feel the night press closer, not as pressure, but as presence. It is no longer something beyond the group. It is something surrounding it completely, with only the faintest remnants of fire separating inside from outside. A mainstream finding in sleep research is that even in deep rest, the human brain continues to process environmental stimuli at a reduced but functional level, allowing for selective responsiveness to potentially significant changes. This system likely reflects deep evolutionary pressures from environments where full disengagement from awareness carried risk. The embers dim further. At times, they seem almost gone, then briefly return in a soft glow as ash shifts. This irregularity creates a slow rhythm that shapes the perception of time itself. A lesser discussed archaeological interpretation suggests that repeated nighttime clustering around hearths may have contributed to the development of early spatial memory frameworks, where safety was associated not only with people but with specific physical arrangements of space. You notice that even in near darkness, you can still locate the group without fully seeing them. Presence becomes something felt rather than observed. The night continues without interruption. No sudden changes occur, only gradual deepening. The world feels suspended in a quiet equilibrium between awareness and rest. Inside your mind, thoughts begin to loosen. Images form and dissolve without structure. The distinction between memory, perception, and imagination becomes less stable. This is not confusion, it is transition towards sleep. And in this softened edge between waking and dreaming, you begin to sense how deeply embedded fear truly is. Not as interruption, not as alarm, but as a continuous background process that has followed human awareness from its earliest nights. Still present, still quiet, still shaping how reality is held together in the dark. The embers are now so faint that they feel more like an idea than a source of light. Occasionally, a soft orange pulse appears beneath the ash, then fades again, as if the fire is breathing in its final slow rhythm. The valley is fully absorbed by darkness now, and yet it does not feel empty. It feels occupied by possibility. The group is almost entirely asleep. Only a few remain in a half-waking state, their bodies still, their awareness drifting in and out like gentle waves. Even those who are asleep do not appear completely disconnected from the environment. There is a sense of continuous presence, as if awareness has not fully left, only softened. To understand what begins to emerge at this stage of human history, it helps to consider how early societies started forming structured ideas about order, authority, and meaning. Archaeological evidence from later prehistoric periods shows increasing signs of ritual behavior, burial practices, and spatial organization that suggest humans were beginning to think beyond immediate survival. You remain on the edge of sleep, aware of the faint outlines of bodies around you. The world feels compressed into a small circle of shared existence, surrounded by vast abstractions that no longer demands immediate interpretation, but still exists as a quiet presence. A widely supported idea in anthropology is that as human groups grew more complex, fear began to take on social dimensions, influencing not only individual survival, but also group cohesion, hierarchy, and shared belief systems. In this view, fear becomes part of social structure, not just personal experience. You notice how even in slumps, the group feels organized. Certain individuals are positioned slightly closer to the center. Others remain oriented outward. This arrangement is not formally decided, yet it persists as if shaped by long repetition. A lesser-known observation from archaeological site analysis is that spatial organization in early camps often shows consistent patterns, suggesting that social roles and environmental awareness were physically expressed through positioning around shared spaces like hearths. The embers shift again, briefly brightening as a pocket of ash collapses inward. The glow reveals the group for a moment, then fades. No one reacts. The moment passes without interpretation. Fear here is no longer reactive in a physical sense. It has become anticipatory, embedded in how the mind organizes uncertainty even during rest. It is less about what is happening and more about what could be happening. A mainstream finding in cognitive neuroscience is that the human brain continuously generates predictive models of the environment, even during sleep. These models help the system remain partially attuned to external changes, allowing for rapid reactivation if needed. You feel this in fragments, a distant awareness of space, a sensitivity to sound that rises and falls without clear cause. It is not thought, it is structure beneath thought. A quirky detail often mentioned in sleep studies is that humans frequently incorporate environmental sounds into dream content, suggesting that external stimuli are not fully excluded during sleep but integrated into internal narratives. Around you, breathing is slow and steady. The group is now fully in rest, but the arrangement of bodies still reflects earlier patterns of vigilance. Even sleep carries the memory of survival. Some researchers suggest that this blending of rest and awareness may have been essential in early environments where threats could emerge at any time, making complete sensory shutdown disadvantageous. Others propose that sleep evolved primarily for cognitive restoration, with vigilant systems being secondary adaptations layered on top. The night deepens further. Stars remain faintly visible, though the sky feels heavier now, as if distance itself has thickened. The world beyond the group is no longer interpreted, it is simply acknowledged. A lesser discussed archaeological insight is that some early sleeping sites show evidence of repeated occupation across generations, implying that certain locations were remembered not just as resource points, but as safe zones embedded in collective memory. You adjust slightly, feeling the ground beneath you cool further. The warmth from the fire is almost gone now, replaced by the steady temperature of the earth. The transition feels gradual, almost imperceptible. Fear, in this stage of human experience, is no longer tied to immediate sensation. It is embedded in structure, in memory, in expectation. It does not announce itself. It supports everything quietly from beneath awareness. A widely accepted principle in evolutionary theory is that systems which enhance survival without requiring constant activation tend to become deeply integrated into baseline cognition. Fear is one of these systems, continuously available but not always visible. The embers flicker one last time with a faint, uneven pulse, then they settle again into near darkness. The circle remains. But its centre is no longer defined by light, it is defined by presence alone. And as you drift closer to sleep, you begin to sense that what humans call fear is not something added to the mind over time. It is something the mind was built around from the very beginning, still quietly shaping how awareness holds the world together in the absence of light. The last trace of embers has nearly vanished now, leaving only a faint suggestion of warmth buried in the ash. The fire is no longer something you see clearly, it is something you remember is there, even as your eyes struggle to confirm it. The valley is fully dark, but not empty. It feels filled with invisible depth, like layers of space folded over one another. The group is now deeply asleep. Movement is rare and subtle, limited to small shifts of breathing or the occasional adjustment of posture, even in this state. There is an impression of collective stability, as if the group still functions as a single quiet system, even when consciousness is fragmented. To understand what this moment represents in the long history of human experience, it helps to look at how fear and meaning began to intersect more deeply in early societies. Archaeological findings from the Neolithic transition suggest that as humans began forming more permanent settlements, their relationship with uncertainty changed. The environment became partially controlled, yet unpredictability still remained a constant factor. You lie still, half aware, feeling the boundary between thought and sleep becoming less distinct. The darkness no longer feels like something external. It feels internal as well, as if it has entered perception itself. A widely supported idea in anthropology is that as human societies became more complex, fear began to extend beyond immediate physical threats and into abstract domains such as social standing, unknown forces, and future uncertainty. This shift did not replace older survival instincts, but layered additional complexity onto them. Around you, the sleeping group forms a loose pattern across the ground. Some bodies are close together, others slightly separated, but all remain oriented in ways that suggest unconscious preference for visibility and proximity. Even sleep carries traces of earlier awareness. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic fieldwork is that in many traditional societies, sleeping arrangements continue to reflect social relationships and perceived trust levels within the group. Even without deliberate planning, these patterns often emerge organically through repeated experience rather than instruction. The night remains still, but not static. Subtle shifts in air temperature move across the valley, causing faint sounds in the grass that rise and fall without pattern. Each sound briefly enters awareness before dissolving again into silence. Fear at this stage is no longer something that produces action. It is something that shapes perception itself. The mind continues to evaluate the environment even when no immediate response is required. A mainstream finding in cognitive neuroscience is that during sleep, the brain continues to monitor auditory stimuli at a reduced level of processing, allowing for selective responsiveness to potentially significant changes in the environment. This mechanism reflects deep evolutionary pressure to maintain partial awareness even during rest. You feel this in a very softened form, not alertness, but a thin thread of awareness that remains connected to the surrounding space. It is almost like listening without trying to listen. A quirky detail often reported in sleep research is that environmental sounds such as wind, distant movement, or fire crackling can be incorporated into dream narratives in subtle ways, blending external input with internal imagery. The fire is now fully gone in appearance, though its presence remains in warmth held by the ground. The centre of the circle is no longer defined by light, but by memory of light. This absence feels structured, almost intentional. Some researchers propose that the human tendency to maintain emotional and cognitive models of the environment during sleep may have evolved to allow rapid re-engagement with waking awareness if conditions change suddenly. Others argue that dream activity serves primarily internal cognitive functions unrelated to immediate survival. The discussion remains open across multiple disciplines. You shift slightly, feeling the earth beneath you release heat slowly into the night air. The sensation is subtle, but grounding. It connects you to something stubble beneath the shifting layers of perception. A lesser discussed archaeological interpretation suggests that repeated habitation of specific sleeping sites over generations may have contributed to early forms of cultural memory, where places became associated with safety, continuity, and a shared experience across time. The valley outside the group remains unknown, but it no longer feels distant in the same way. It feels integrated into awareness, present even in its invisibility. Darkness is not absence here. It is structure without detail. Fear in this form is not active. Yet it remains present. It is woven into the way the mind holds uncertainty. Even when nothing is happening, it is not a reaction. It is a condition. A widely accepted principle in evolutionary biology is that traits which enhance survival, without requiring conscious activation, tend to become deeply embedded in baseline neural processing. Fear, in this sense, is not an interruption of normal cognition. It is part of its foundation. The night continues without change. Breathing remains slow. The group remains still. The world remains vast but contained within perception, and as you drift further into sleep, you begin to sense that fear is not something humanity learned to overcome. It is something humanity learned to live beside, quietly shaping how awareness remains open even in complete darkness. The night has now fully settled into its deepest phase. There is no remaining trace of firelight, only the faintest warmth held in the soil where the embers once were. The valley is entirely shaped by darkness, but it is not a flat emptiness. It feels textured, layered, as if the night itself has depth you could move through if you knew how. The group is fully asleep now. Bodies lie scattered in a loose, natural arrangement that still subtly reflects earlier habits of vigilance and proximity, even in unconsciousness. There is a sense of order that did not disappear when awareness faded. It simply softened. To understand what this stage represents in the long arc of human development, it helps to move forward in time to early agricultural societies, where the relationship between fear and stability began to shift. Archaeological records from the Neolithic period show that as farming emerged, humans experienced fewer immediate environmental threats compared to nomadic foraging, but began facing new kinds of uncertainty tied to weather, crops, and long-term survival planning. You remain half within sleep, half within awareness. The boundary between internal thought and external world feels thinner now, as if perception itself is dissolving into something more fluid. One well-supported interpretation in anthropological research suggests that as human societies became more sedentary, fear gradually expanded from immediate physical survival into broader concerns about future uncertainty, including resource scarcity, social hierarchy, and environmental unpredictability. Around you, breathing continues in a slow, steady rhythm. It is not synchronized, yet it feels harmonized through repetition. The group exists now as a quiet field of presence rather than individual activity. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic parallels is that agricultural communities often develop new forms of nighttime anxiety tied not to predators, but to uncertainty about stored resources, weather patterns, and long-term survival. This represents a shift from immediate to anticipatory forms of concern. The darkness feels different now than earlier in the night. It is no longer something that presses in from outside. It feels more like something that exists equally everywhere, including within perception itself. Fear at this stage is no longer tied to motion or sound alone. It begins to operate through imagination. through projection of possible futures rather than reaction to present stimuli. A widely accepted finding in cognitive science is that the human brain continuously constructs simulations of possible future outcomes, even during rest states. These predictive processes are believed to be fundamental to planning and adaptive behavior. You notice how thoughts drift without structure. Images appear briefly and dissolve. There is no narrative continuity, only fragments of perception and memory blending together. A quirky detail often discussed in sleep and perception studies is that even in deep rest, the brain remains sensitive to emotionally relevant stimuli, which may influence dream content or brief arousals without full awakening. The ground beneath you is cool now, the earlier warmth from the fire almost completely gone. That absence itself becomes noticeable, as if something expected is no longer present, even though nothing has changed recently. Some researchers suggest that the transition from foraging to farming may have altered the nature of fear itself, shifting it from immediate environmental responsiveness toward longer-duration cognitive concern. Others argue that this shift was gradual and uneven across regions, influenced by local ecological conditions rather than a single evolutionary transition. The night air moves slightly through the valley, creating soft ripples in the grass that cannot be fully seen but are faintly heard. Each sound briefly enters awareness before fading again into silence. A lesser discussed archaeological insight is that early farming settlements often show evidence of increasingly complex storage systems, suggesting that anticipation of future scarcity became an important factor in daily life organization. You feel how even in this near-sleep state, awareness still tracks changes in the environment at a minimal level. It is not active attention, it is residual monitoring, like a quiet background process that never fully shuts down. Fear, in this form, is no longer about immediate survival in open landscapes. It becomes more abstract, more internal, tied to expectation rather than perception. A mainstream idea in evolutionary neuroscience is that predictive processing systems in the brain allow humans to simulate possible futures in order to prepare responses in advance, a mechanism that likely provided significant adaptive advantage in variable environments. The group remains completely still now. Only the faintest shifts of breathing mark the passage of time. The valley beyond is indistinguishable from sky, ground, and distance. Everything has merged into a single field of darkness, and as you drift deeper towards a sleep, you begin to understand that fear has not reduced across human history. It has transformed, adapting to new environments, new uncertainties, and new ways of thinking. It has followed humanity not as a shadow behind it, but as a structure within it, shaping how reality is continuously imagined, even in the quietest moments of night. The night is now at its most still point, the kind of silence that feels almost complete, yet never truly is. There is no fire, no movement from the group, only the slow rhythm of sleep stretching across the ground like an invisible thread connecting every resting body. You're drifting more deeply now, no longer fully anchored to waking perception. Thoughts arrive without clear origin and dissolve without conclusion. The world is no longer being observed in a structured way. It is being experienced as fragments, as impressions. To understand what begins to change in this phase of human history, it helps to move forward to the early development of systematic thinking during classical antiquity and later pre-scientific eras. Historical records and philosophical texts from ancient civilizations show an increasing effort to explain fear not only through myth or ritual, but through reasoning about the body, mind, and environment. A widely supported idea in the history of science is that early natural philosophers began to shift explanations of human emotion from supernatural causes toward physical and psychological principles, laying early foundations for later fields such as medicine and psychology. Around you, the sleeping group remains unchanged, yet your perception of them subtly shifts. They are no longer just bodies resting in darkness. They feel like part of a larger system, a temporary stillness within a much longer process of life unfolding across time. A lesser-known observation from historical anthropology is that even in early written cultures, fear was often categorized alongside bodily states such as hunger or fatigue, suggesting that it was understood as both physical and experiential rather than purely emotional in the modern sense. The darkness feels less threatening now and more absolute. It does not move, it does not change, it simply exists, and in that stillness, the mind begins to fill space with interpretation, even when no stimulus is present. Fear at this level is no longer triggered by external cues alone. It becomes self-generating in subtle ways, arising from internal prediction, memory, and imagination. A widely accepted concept in cognitive neuroscience is that the brain's predictive systems continue operating during sleep, generating simulations that integrate past experience with possible future scenarios, often without conscious awareness. You feel this process blurring inside perception. Images form briefly, perhaps of a movement, perhaps of open landscapes, perhaps of unknown presence, then dissolve before they can stabilize. A quirky detail often noted in sleep research is that dream content frequently incorporates emotional residues from waking life, reorganizing them into symbolic or fragmented narratives that do not always follow logical structure. The ground beneath you feels distant now, as if awareness is no longer fully tied to physical sensation. Instead, sensation comes in waves sometimes clear, sometimes absent, as if perception itself is fading in and out. Some researchers propose that early human cognition may have relied heavily on this blending of perception and imagination, especially during rest states, allowing the brain to rehearse possible responses to uncertain environments even when no immediate danger was present. Others argue that dreaming may serve primarily internal cognitive maintenance functions unrelated to direct survival rehearsal. The group around you remains silent, but their presence is still detectable through rhythm. Breathing rises and falls in scattered patterns, forming a subtle background structure that replaces the earlier role of fire. A lesser discussed archaeological interpretation suggests that in some early settlements, sleeping arrangements were deliberately organized not only for warmth and protection, but also for maintaining social cohesion through shared proximity during vulnerable states. You begin to sense how deeply embedded this system is. Even in sleep, there is no full separation from environment. Awareness is reduced, but never entirely absent. Fear in this context is no longer something that appears. It is something that persists at a very low level, woven into the architecture of cognition itself, shaping how the mind organizes uncertainty even when consciousness is not fully active. A mainstream finding in neuroscience is that the brain's default activity during rest includes continuous monitoring of internal and external states, maintaining a readiness to respond to significant changes even in low awareness conditions. The night continues without interruption, no sudden events occur, no changes demand reaction, only the slow passage of time, experienced not as sequence, but as gradual fading, and as you drift further into sleep, you begin to sense something quietly profound. Fear has not left humanity at any point in its history. It has simply changed its form, moving from immediate reaction to interpretation, to prediction, and finally into the background structure of thought itself, still present even when nothing seems to be happening at all. The night feels different now, not because anything has changed in the world around you, but because your awareness has thinned to its softest edge. The valley, the group, even the ground beneath you, all of it feels distant, like it exists behind a veil that is no longer fully transparent. Sleep is deeper now among the group. Their presence is still detectable, but only faintly. The sense of collective structure remains. Though it is no longer visible or actively felt, it is something your mind assumes rather than perceives directly. To understand what fear becomes in the modern era of human development, it helps to move forward into the period of industrialization and early urban expansion. Historical records show that as human environments became more built and technologically complex, immediate survival threats from nature decreased in many regions, but new forms of psychological strain began to emerge tied to rapid change, social density, and unfamiliar environments. You drift through fragments of thought, no longer fully distinguishing between observation and imagination. The world feels reconstructed internally rather than perceived externally. A widely supported idea in social history is that industrialization shifted human fear from environmental uncertainty towards systemic and social uncertainty, including concerns about economic stability, urban overcrowding, and unfamiliar technological systems. Around you, the sleeping forms are now barely distinguishable from the ground itself. The boundary between body and landscape feels reduced, as if everything has returned to a shared stillness. A lesser-known observation from historical psychology is that early urban populations often reported new forms of anxiety linked not to predators or nature, but to social comparison, anonymity, and the speed of environmental change. The darkness feels less like an external force now, and more like an internal condition. It is not something surrounding you, it is something you are partially within. Fear at this stage no longer relies on immediate sensory input. It is shaped increasingly by anticipation, abstraction, and the mind's ability to simulate complex future scenarios. A widely accepted principle in modern cognitive science is that the human brain's predictive systems became more complex alongside technological and social development, allowing for more detailed modelling of potential outcomes, but also increasing sensitivity to imagined threats. You feel this in the drifting nature of thought. Brief impressions of movement, structure, sound, and presence appear without clear origin, then fade before they can stabilise into meaning. A quirky detail often noted in psychological research is that modern humans frequently experience heightened anxiety in environments with excessive ambiguity or information overload. Even when physical safety is objectively high, the ground beneath you feels cooler now, and that sensation becomes one of the few stable anchors in perception. Everything else seems fluid, shifting gently between clarity and obscurity. Some researchers suggest that industrialization did not create new emotional systems, but rather amplified existing ones by increasing the complexity and pace of environmental feedback. Others argue that modern fear responses are qualitatively different due to cognitive overload and symbolic abstraction. The group remains motionless, but the idea of the group still persists in awareness. It is no longer a visual reality, it is a conceptual one, maintained by memory and inference. A lesser discussed sociological observation is that even in modern societies, humans continue to rely on subtle environmental scanning behaviours, such as checking exits, monitoring sounds, and orienting toward perceived sources of uncertainty, often without conscious awareness. You notice how even in this near-sleep state, awareness still drifts toward patterns rather than details. Not specific objects, but the possibility of change itself. Fear, in this form, is no longer about survival in a physical landscape. It becomes about navigating complexity, uncertainty, and the constant projection of possible futures within the mind. A mainstream finding in neuroscience is that higher-order cognitive regions involved in planning and simulation remain active during sleep, contributing to dream construction and emotional processing even in the absence of external input. The night continues in complete stillness. There is no fire, no movement, no sound that demands attention, only the quiet persistence of existence unfolding without interruption. And as you drift further into sleep, you begin to sense that fear has now fully transitioned into something abstract and continuous. It is no longer tied to any single environment or moment. It's embedded in the way the mind constructs reality itself, shaping every possibility before it is even fully formed. The night has softened into its final, deepest form. It no longer feels like a time of day. It feels like a condition. Something the world has entered and will not easily leave until morning returns with its slow, uncertain light. Everything is still, but not frozen. It is more like the world is resting in place. Your awareness is now very light, drifting close to sleep. Thoughts appear as fragments rather than sequences. There is no effort to follow them. They rise, fade, and are replaced without urgency. To understand how fear is interpreted in the modern scientific age, it helps to move into the development of psychology and neuroscience as formal disciplines. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers began systematically studying emotion as a measurable and observable process, using experiments, clinical observation, and early brain imaging techniques. A well-established finding in contemporary neuroscience is that fear responses are closely linked to activity in brain regions such as the amygdala, which helps detect potential threats and coordinate rapid physiological reactions before conscious thought fully forms. Around you, the imagined presence of the group remains faint but stable. You no longer clearly see them, yet you still sense their arrangement, as if memory and perception have merged into a single field. A lesser-known observation from early psychological case studies is that individuals often report heightened sensitivity to uncertainty during transitional states between wakefulness and sleep. When the brain's predictive systems are active but external input is reduced, the darkness is no longer something external you're observing, it is something your awareness is moving through. It has become spatial in a different way, not defined by distance, but by depth. Fear, in this modern understanding, is no longer treated as a simple instinct. It is seen as a complex system involving prediction, memory, physiology, and interpretation working together in real time. A widely supported concept in neuroscience is that the brain functions as a predictive engine, constantly generating models of the environment and updating them based on incoming sensory data, with fear emerging when predictions signal potential threat or uncertainty. You drift through brief mental images, movement without source, sound without origin, faces without clear identity. Each one dissolves before it becomes stable enough to hold. A quirky detail often noted in sleep research is that the boundary between dreaming and waking thought is not fixed, but gradual, with overlapping neural activity patterns that allow external sensations to blend into internal narratives. The ground beneath you is no longer clearly felt, yet there is still a vague sense of support, as if the idea of ground remains even when sensation fades. Some researchers argue that modern fear is heavily shaped by symbolic thinking, allowing humans to experience anxiety about abstract concepts such as future events, identity, and social evaluation. Others propose that these responses are extensions of older survival systems that have been repurposed rather than fundamentally transformed. The group around you is now almost entirely conceptual, not seen, not heard, but inferred. Their presence exists as a stable assumption within your awareness, even without sensory confirmation. A lesser discussed finding in behavioral science is that humans tend to maintain a low level of background vigilance even in safe and familiar environments, suggesting that complete psychological relaxation is rare or transient in natural conditions. You feel how attention itself is thinning. It no longer holds on to objects. It drifts between impressions like a slow current moving without direction. Fear, in this late stage of interpretation, is no longer something that interrupts experience. It becomes part of how experience is structured, influencing what the mind expects, imagines, and prioritizes even in the absence of real stimuli. A mainstream idea in cognitive theory is that Perception is not passive reception of reality, but active construction, where the brain continuously generates hypotheses about the world and adjusts them based on available information. The night is now almost indistinguishable from sleep. There is no clear separation between thinking and not thinking, only gradual fading. And as you reach the quietest edge of awareness, you begin to understand that fear has never been a separate thread in human history. It has always been woven into the fabric of perception itself, shaping how reality is formed long before it is ever consciously understood. There is no clear moment where the night ends now, only a gradual softening of everything that once felt distinct. Thought becomes lighter, slower, less attached to itself. The world is no longer something you are inside or outside of. It is something dissolving gently around awareness. The group is no longer something you can truly locate. Not because it has disappeared, but because perception has let go of the need to separate individuals from environment. Everything blends into a single quiet presence that feels stable, even without definition. To understand the final shape of fear in this journey through human history, it helps to step back from every era you have passed through, from ancient savannas to early settlements, from firelit nights to modern cognitive thought. Across all of them, one pattern remains consistent. Fear never disappears. It only changes its language. A widely supported conclusion in contemporary evolutionary theory is that fear functions as a continuous adaptive system, designed not to eliminate uncertainty, but to help organisms exist alongside it, adjusting behavior across changing environments and levels of knowledge. You are no longer walking through history. You are drifting through it as memory. The savannah, the fire, the valley, the sleeping group, all of it feels like layers of the same single idea slowly folding inward. A lesser-known observation in comparative neuroscience is that even highly evolved brains maintain ancient subcortical circuits that operate beneath conscious awareness, continuously evaluating environmental and internal signals for relevance, safety, and change. Now there is only quiet, not absence of sound, but absence of demand. Nothing asks for response anymore. Everything simply exists without instruction. Fear, in its most essential form, is not a reaction to danger. It is a structure of attention that allows existence to remain open to change. Without it, perception would not know what to prioritize. With it, reality becomes organized around possibility. A mainstream idea in cognitive science is that consciousness itself is shaped by predictive processing, where the brain constructs a continuous model of reality and updates it moment by moment, with emotion functioning as a weighting system that determines significance. Even now, in this fading edge of awareness, there are still fragments of sensation, sense of depth, a sense of presence, a sense that something could change even if nothing does. A quirky detail often mentioned in sleep and consciousness research is that the final stages before deep sleep often involve spontaneous reductions in narrative thought, replaced by brief sensory impressions that are no longer organized into time. There is no longer a clear distinction between ancient and modern, between survival and reflection. All of it exists as one continuous thread, stretching across time, shaped by the same underlying mechanism of awareness responding to uncertainty. Some researchers suggest that fear is best understood not as an emotion that evolved and stabilized, but as an ongoing regulatory system that remains active as long as consciousness exists. Others suggest it may be inseparable from awareness itself, a necessary companion to perception in any living mind. The night is no longer something around you, it is something within you, and even that distinction begins to fade. A lesser discussed perspective in philosophy of mind proposes that what humans call emotion may simply be different configurations of attention under conditions of uncertainty. Rather than separate psychological categories, everything becomes softer now, less defined, less separate. The valley, the fire, the group, the history, the mind observing it all. Each one dissolves into the same quiet continuity, and as the final traces of awareness settle into sleep, what remains is not fear, not absence of fear, but the quiet system beneath both, still present, still steady, still holding the shape of experience together as it has always done across every moment of human existence. The night no longer feels like something that surrounds you. It feels like something you are gently sinking into, layer by layer, until even the idea of distance begins to soften. There is no valley now, no group, no fire, only the slow fading impression of presence itself. Everything that once felt distinct begins to blur in a calm and natural way. Thoughts do not end, they simply lose their edges, like footprints in soft earth slowly being covered by wind. Nothing disappears suddenly. It all becomes quieter, more distant, more peaceful. Across the long journey you have moved through, from ancient savannas to early human firelight, from uncertain shadows to structured civilizations, and finally into the modern understanding of the mind, one quiet pattern has remained steady beneath it all. Awareness has always been shaped by uncertainty, and fear has always been one of the ways that uncertainty is held gently in place. Now even that understanding begins to fade. There is no need to follow ideas anymore, no need to connect time or a meaning. Everything exists in a simple resting state, where even question feels far away. The body feels heavier now, but not in a burdensome way, more like it is being supported completely by something unseen and steady. Breathing continues without effort. Time becomes unimportant, then unnoticeable, then irrelevant. If there is any final sensation left, it is softness, a quiet dissolving into rest. Not an ending, but a release of a tension, like closing the eyes without realizing when they were open for the last time. And as sleep finally settles in fully, even fear becomes something distant and unnecessary to hold. Not gone, but quiet, not removed, but no longer needed. Only calm remains, deep, steady calm. The kind that does not ask to be noticed, because it is already everywhere. Sweet dreams.